One of the harshest and most unforgiving landscapes on Earth is stirring. The Himalayas, long regarded as a near impenetrable wall of snow and stone, are being reshaped in silence got open by fresh scars of concrete and steel. Roads appear where only goat tracks once meandered. Runways stretch across high-altitude plateaus where oxygen is scarce and the human body falters. Dams rise on rivers that for centuries flowed freely from the glaciers, their waters tumbling unchecked into the valleys of South Asia. On the surface, it can be mistaken for development bridges for villagers, roads for commerce, hydro projects for energy. But step back, and a different pattern reveals itself. One not of civil convenience, but of strategic design. The Himalayas are more than mountains. They are a living frontier, a geography that dictates politics, a wall that both divides and connects. For centuries, empires crashed against these peaks. The British Raj called it the natural frontier. For Beijing today, it is something else entirely, a frontier to be engineered. Every runway carved into permafrost, every dam planted on a roaring gorge, every road etched into a vertical cliff serves a purpose. Not just access, but reach. Not just mobility, but projection. The terrain is being transformed into a military corridor, one that could move troops, armor, and supplies with a speed the mountains once denied. And this matters, because here, borders are not agreed upon with pen and treaty, but with patrols and presence. The line of actual control, Balak, remains an ambiguous, shifting line across ridges and valleys. Where soldiers walk, where outposts stand, there lies sovereignty. It is a frontier without fences, defined only by how far one dares to march. In this peculiar cartography, building infrastructure is a way of drawing maps in concrete. Each road leading to a forward base, each airstrip built within sight of contested valleys, is a claim silent yet undeniable. What makes this transformation so unsettling is its duality. Much of China's buildup is cloaked as dual-use infrastructure. A road that carries villagers' trucks can also carry armored convoys. A civilian airport with holiday traffic by day can host fighter jets by night. A hydro dam meant to light cities can, at will, choke the rivers of another nation. The ambiguity is deliberate. It allows Beijing to insist on innocence while reaping the benefits of strategic depth. For India, watching across the ridges, there is little comfort in such ambiguity. What looks like insurance to Beijing looks like encroachment to New Delhi. To understand the gravity of this awakening, one must consider the scale. These projects are not isolated. They form a network, a vast lattice of asphalt, steel, and turbines stretched across the roof of the world. Their scale dwarfs anything seen outside of wartime mobilization. In less than a decade, more than 300 projects have been pushed into Tibet. Highways like G219 and G318 widened and reinforced. Air bases multiplied, and whole valleys reshaped. The hand of the state moves with astonishing speed. Concrete is poured faster than the world reacts. But this awakening is not just about the here and now. It is about the long view. Beijing's engineers are not simply taming rivers and paving mountains for today's disputes. They are preparing the frontier for decades of tension yet to come. To build a runway at 4,000 meters elevation is not an act of short-term strategy. It is an investment in permanence. To carve a railway across unstable permafrost is to bet on control for generations. The Himalayas are being prepared, not for a season of rivalry, but for an era of rivalry. And so, the mountains themselves become actors in a geopolitical drama. Once barriers, they are being converted into conduits of power. Once protectors of isolation, they are becoming amplifiers of reach. The awakening is not loud. It is quiet, methodical, relentless. And it sends a message without ever needing words. That the roof of the world is no longer just a wilderness. It is becoming an engine of strategy, a fortress in slow construction, a chessboard where every bridge and bunker is a piece placed in advance of a game not yet played. For India, this reality is unavoidable. For China, it is deliberate. And for the rest of the world, it is a reminder. Even the most remote corners of Earth are not beyond the designs of power. The Himalayas are awakening. And with them, so too, is the possibility of a future conflict written not just in treaties or speeches, but in the very stones of the mountains themselves. From the wind-swept plateaus of Tibet, Beijing sees not just barren mountains and thin air, but a strategic frontier that holds the key to dominance over South Asia. 2. China's military planners. Tibet is not merely a cultural or historical region, it is the shield, the staging ground, and the high vantage point in its simmering rivalry with India. For decades, the People's Liberation Army (PLA) has transformed this rugged land into a fortress. The modernization began slowly after China's 1962 war with India, but in recent years it has accelerated with startling speed. New airbases carved into the highlands, extended runways capable of handling fighter jets and heavy transport aircraft, and hardened shelters dug into the mountainsides now dot the Tibetan plateau. These bases at Angari Gunza, Chagates, and Lhasa Gangar are not just symbolic, they place advanced aircraft within striking distance of India's borderlands in Ladakh, Arunachal Pradesh, and Sikkim. But the true power of Tibet lies not only in the skies, it lies in the infrastructure web woven by China. Highways snaked through mountains that once seemed impassable. The G219 highway, for example, stretches like a steel artery across western Tibet, connecting Xinjiang to the region of Angari, right at India's doorstep in Ladakh. Alongside it, the Qinghai-Tibet Railway, an engineering marvel at extreme altitudes, allows China to move troops, armor, and supplies at a pace that India struggles to match. What once required weeks of mule caravans can now be done in hours. Satellite imagery over the past 5 years reveals another layer of preparation: permanent housing for soldiers, storage depots for fuel and ammunition, and radar stations peering across the Himalayas. This is not temporary deployment, tight is a vision of long-term readiness. Every year, the PLA conducts high-altitude exercises here, acclimating troops to thin air and testing logistics under extreme conditions. India's military, though battle-hardened in the heights, faces a constant disadvantage. Moving reinforcements up treacherous mountain passes takes time, while China's soldiers already wait on the plateau. Tibet also offers a psychological advantage. From this roof of the world, Beijing projects not just military might but political control. By tightly integrating Tibet into its national security doctrine, China signals that the region is not merely a defensive barrier but an offensive launchpad. For India, every bridge across a Tibetan river, every tunnel drilled through a mountain, and every radar dome erected under the thin blue sky represents more than infrastructure. It is a chess move in a looming great power contest. The Himalayan awakening was the spark. Tibet is the high ground where strategies harden into steel. But the real test lies ahead: how China plans to fuse its geography, infrastructure, and military doctrine into a credible force that could one day challenge India. Not just at the border, but across the wider Indo. If geography grants China the high ground, it is infrastructure that transforms those frozen heights into a living artery of power. Nowhere is this more visible than in Tibet and Xinjiang, where Beijing has unleashed what can only be described as an infrastructure blitz, a campaign of roads, railways, tunnels, and airfields designed not only for development, but for dominance. The scale is staggering. Over the past 2 decades, China has poured billions into building expressways that slice through Himalayan ridges, bridges that span gorges once thought impassable, and tunnels that pierce the very heart of the mountains. Where caravans of yaks once trudged for weeks, armored convoys can now roll in hours. For the People's Liberation Army (PLA), this is not just convenience, it is strategy. Every highway doubling as a military supply route, every railway station a potential troop transfer hub. The G219 highway, China's crown jewel, exemplifies this logic. Stretching more than 2,000 kilometers across Xinjiang and Tibet, it skirts the line of actual control. Like with India, in peacetime, it connects isolated towns. In crisis, it can funnel reinforcements, tanks, and artillery straight toward the contested frontier. Parallel to it, the Qinghai-Tibet Railway, the world's highest, has been extended deeper into the plateau, with spurs reaching toward Chagates and beyond. Beijing has announced plans for even more extensions, inching rail lines ever closer to the border. The numbers tell their own story. A single military train on the Qinghai-Tibet line can carry a full brigade of troops along with their equipment. Combined with newly upgraded highways, this creates a dual-channel system of movement. Fast, massive, and sustainable. By comparison, India's border roads, though improving, remain slower, more fragile, and more vulnerable to landslides and weather. Air power completes the picture. The PLA has not only expanded airbases at Lhasa and Angari and Chagates, but also built heliports and drone launch sites along the plateau. These facilities shorten the response time from days to hours, enabling rapid mobilization of special forces and surveillance drones. Even civilian airports in Tibet are designed with dual-use potential, ready to pivot to military logistics in the event of conflict. The most striking element of this blitz is its redundancy. China is not relying on a single road, a single rail line, or a single base. Instead, it has woven a web of connections so dense that even if India were to target one link, others remain functional. This redundancy creates resilience, the backbone of sustained military operations. To Beijing, infrastructure is not only about moving men and machines, it is about psychological projection. Each new bridge across a river, each highway winding through glaciers, sends a message to New Delhi. China can come fast, in strength, and at scale. The PLA can fight not just a short skirmish, but, if necessary, a drawn-out campaign. But speed cuts both ways. By making its intentions visible, Beijing also raises the stakes. India, aware of the widening gap, has rushed to upgrade its own roads and forward airstrips in Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh. The Himalayas are no longer just natural barriers, they are becoming a militarized transport corridor, where every kilometer of asphalt and every meter of rail track could one day decide the fate of a border war. The infrastructure blitz is more than steel, and concrete it is the skeleton of a future battlefield. Yet even skeletons need flesh. In China's case, that flesh comes in the form of new military doctrine, technology, and forced deployments, the next phase of preparation for the unthinkable. On the surface, China's rapid development of Tibet and Xinjiang looks like a story of modernization, gleaming airports, high-speed railways, and bustling new towns rising from what were once isolated frontiers. But beneath this civilian facade lies a deeper purpose: the transformation of ordinary infrastructure into Dulu's platforms ready for war. Take the airports. Lasagongar Shagat's Peace and Ngari Gunsa are officially billed as civilian airports, meant to boost tourism and trade in Tibet, yet each has been upgraded with long runways, hardened shelters, and fuel storage facilities that exceed civilian needs. Commercial terminals coexist with military hangars, and when tensions spike with India, flights carrying tourists can be replaced overnight by sorties of J-20 stealth fighters or Y-20. Heavy transports ferrying troops and armor. Railways tell the same story. The Qinghai-Tibet Railway was a triumph of engineering for civilian travel, but its military role is undeniable. Freight yards and sidings are strategically placed for rapid offloading of equipment, while tunnels and bridges built for passenger convenience double as arteries for war logistics. With the extension of this network deeper into Tibet reach in Shagats and heading toward Nepal's border, Beijing gains the ability to shift military assets at speeds India cannot hope to match through its mountain passes. Even newly built cities in Tibet reflect this Dulu's pattern. Housing blocks and commercial districts rise beside military depots and PLA barracks. Roads that seem designed for trade can suddenly become supply lines for armored vehicles. Fiber optic cables, laid to improve internet access for civilians, also serve command and control systems linking PLA units to Beijing's Western Theater Command. This blurring of the civilian and the military is deliberate. China calls it civil-military fusion, a doctrine that ensures every piece of national development serves both economic progress and wartime readiness. In Tibet, civil-military fusion transforms the region into a launchpad. Every airport is a potential airbase, every highway a military supply route, every dam a possible power source for wartime industry. For India, this creates a nightmare scenario. While New Delhi builds infrastructure primarily for defense needs in border areas, China masks its buildup under the banner of civilian development, allowing it to outpace and outscale India without provoking immediate suspicion. By the time tensions erupt into crisis, the civilian hubs of today can seamlessly pivot into the military nodes of tomorrow, leaving the PLA already entrenched in the high ground. From these disguised strongholds, Beijing can project force not only into the Himalayas, but also across South Asia. And this is where the balance tilts. China's frontier is no longer just a line of defense, it is an entire ecosystem, woven with dual-purpose threads, that can be activated in an instant. If infrastructure forms the bones of China's Himalayan strategy, air power is the muscle. In the thin air of the Tibetan plateau, where terrain and altitude limit mobility, control of the skies becomes the ultimate trump card. Beijing knows this and has spent the past decade weaving a great web of air power across its western frontier. At the center of this web are Tibet's high-altitude airbases. Shagat's Lasagongar and Ngari Gunsa may look modest compared to China's coastal megabases, but their strategic position is unmatched. Each sits close to critical valleys, mountain passes, and potential flashpoints along the line of actual control. Once little more than staging grounds, they now boast extended runways, hardened shelters, radar arrays, and stockpiles of aviation fuel. But it is not just the bases themselves, it is what they host. The People's Liberation Army Air Force, PLAAF, has begun rotating its most advanced aircraft to these airfields. J-20 stealth fighters, designed to outclass India's aging fleet. J-16 multi-role jets, versatile enough to carry both precision-guided munitions and heavy strike payloads. Y-20 strategic transports, capable of airlifting troops, artillery, and even armored vehicles, straight into Tibet. H-6 bombers, with cruise missiles that put Indian bases in Assam and Arunachal Pradesh within striking distance. Supporting these aircraft is a dense lattice of air defense systems. The HQ-29 long-range SAM batteries, answer to the Russian S-400, have been deployed to shield air bases and deny Indian jets freedom of action. In effect, Beijing is building an anti-access area denial A2AD bubble over Tibet, forcing India to fight under constant threat of missile fire. Perhaps most critical is the role of logistics and drones. China has quietly pioneered high-altitude drone operations with platforms like the Wing, Lung 2, and the stealthy WZ-7 Soaring Dragon. These UAVs can loiter for hours, mapping Indian positions, relaying targeting data, and even carrying out strike missions. Combined with a network of early warning radars and satellites, they give the PLA what India lacks: real-time, persistent surveillance over the battlefield. For India, the challenge is daunting. Its frontline air bases Tezpur Chabua and Laur fewer in number, closer to civilian centers, and more vulnerable to Chinese missile strikes. Operating at high altitude also taxes India's aircraft engines and payloads, limiting how much fuel and weapons they can carry. In contrast, China can rotate assets in and out with ease, supported by its vast hinterland. The message is clear. While India may hold the ground, China seeks to own the skies. The Great Web of Air Power is not just about jets and missiles, it is a strategy of dominance, where every radar, drone, and runway ties together into a net India cannot easily break. And this web is still expanding. Each new drone tested, each new SAM deployed, each runway extended brings China one step closer to turning Tibet into a fortress of air supremacy. For Beijing, the mountains may be high, but the sky is wide open. If roads and airbases are the first visible signs of China's Himalayan strategy, the iron rails are its most transformative. For Beijing, railways are more than transports, they are arteries of power, binding Tibet to the Chinese heartland and giving the People's Liberation Army, PLA, an unprecedented logistical edge over India. The crown jewel is the Chinga-Tibet Railway, often hailed as an engineering marvel. Completed in 2006, it snakes over permafrost, crosses bridges suspended above ravines, and climbs to altitudes where oxygen levels are barely half of sea level. What once took weeks of treacherous truck convoys over mountain passes can now be done in a matter of days or even hours, with heavy loads moving seamlessly from inland China into the high plateau. From Lhasa, the network spreads like veins through the mountains. Shigat's extension completed in 2014, bringing rail directly closer to the Indian border. Losanayangsi Railway, inaugurated in 2021. This line runs parallel to the Arunachal Pradesh frontier, within striking distance of India's northeastern defenses. Planned Jiedong Line. If realized, it would push iron tracks even closer to the Doklam Plateau, where India and China clashed in 2017. What makes these railways so strategic is not merely their existence but their dubious design. Passenger trains carry tourists and settlers, knitting Tibet tighter into Beijing's orbit. But sidings, depots, and cargo lines reveal the military purpose. Flat cars designed for tanks, locomotives calibrated for heavy artillery, and tunnels large enough to conceal troop movements. China has also invested in high-speed rail integration. Though high-speed trains are not yet operational across the full Tibetan Plateau, the broader national network allows rapid redeployment from interior military regions. Troops stationed in Chengdu, Lanzhou, or even coastal provinces can be loaded onto trains and delivered to Lhasa or Shigatse in a fraction of the time trucks or aircraft would require. The symbolism is potent. Where once Tibet's remoteness shielded it from outside influence, today iron rails pierce the clouds, a racing distance. This infrastructure gives Beijing what military planners crave most: predictable, high-volume, all-weather logistics. Unlike trucks that struggle on icy passes or planes grounded by sudden Himalayan storms, trains run on schedule, carrying thousands of soldiers, endless supplies of fuel, and even missile launchers to the plateau. For India, the contrast is stark. While it has built roads and airstrips, its own rail penetration into the Himalayas remains limited. Projects like the Sikkim Rail Link and Arunachal extensions remain slow, beset by geography and politics. Without equivalent heavy rail capability, India cannot match China's mass movement advantage across the mountains. In any future conflict, this imbalance could be decisive. China could surge reinforcements into Tibet far faster than India could respond, tilting the balance of attrition. The iron rails through the clouds are not simply steel and stone, they are a strategic lever, ensuring Beijing can keep the pressure on for as long as it takes. Water is life in South Asia, also a potential weapon. Few strategic levers in the Himalayas carry as much latent power as the rivers that rise from the Tibetan Plateau, often called the third pole for its vast glaciers. China, controlling the headwaters of nearly every major river that flows into India, Bangladesh, and beyond, has begun to transform water into a tool of statecraft. At the heart of this lies the Yarlung Tsangpo, known downstream in India as the Brahmaputra. Originating in Tibet, the river arcs dramatically around the Himalayas before plunging into Arunachal Pradesh, where it becomes a lifeline for millions across India and Bangladesh. Beijing's construction of megadams on this river, such as the Zangmu Dam completed in 2015, along with the under-construction superdam at Medad County, is not simply about electricity or development. For Indian strategists, it is about control. These dams serve three functions simultaneously: hydropower and settlement. Officially, Beijing frames them as green energy projects that power Tibet's towns and industries, helping anchor Chinese settlers in the plateau. But each dam is also an assertion of sovereignty, cementing China's grip over Tibet's resources. Strategic leverage. By controlling upstream flows, China gains the ability, at least in theory, to manipulate water supply downstream. In peacetime, this may mean restricting hydrological data to India, as Beijing has done during periods of tension. In conflict, the threat could escalate. Sudden releases of water causing floods, or, conversely, withholding flows during critical agricultural seasons. Military utility. Large reservoirs can double as logistical hubs. They provide electricity to power bases and radar installations, while their waters can support troop settlements at high altitude. More ominously, some analysts note that in wartime, dams themselves could be strategic pressure points, targets that, if struck, unleash catastrophic floods on civilian populations. For India, this is an existential concern. The Brahmaputra sustains agriculture, fisheries, and hydropower for tens of millions. Even slight manipulations upstream could ripple into massive economic and humanitarian consequences downstream. New Delhi fears a scenario where water becomes a bargaining chip, a tool Beijing can wield without firing a single shot. The perception of dams as weapons also feeds mistrust. Each new Chinese announcement of a hydropower project is read in New Delhi, not as development, but as encirclement, part of the broader strategy to weaponize geography. The Brahmaputra is not alone. Rivers like the Sutlej and Indus too are vulnerable to upstream manipulation by Chinese projects in Tibet. What makes this tool so insidious is its ambiguity. Unlike missiles or tanks, the weaponization of water is not overt. Beijing can deny hostile intent, insisting projects are purely economic. Yet the very existence of such infrastructure gives China the option of coercion, should tensions spiral into open conflict. In the Himalayas, where glaciers are melting and climate stress is mounting, the battle for water security is inseparable from the struggle for strategic dominance. For India, every new Chinese dam is not just concrete on a riverette, is a reminder that the taps of life itself may one day be turned into instruments of war. If borders in the Himalayas are drawn in stone and snow, then the rivers carve lines of dependence far more fragile. For India and Bangladesh, the fear is not only Chinese troops pressing down mountain passes, it is the specter of China turning rivers into levers of coercion. At the center of this unease is the Brahmaputra, whose journey from Tibet through India into Bangladesh sustains more than 130 million people. Agriculture in Assam, fisheries in Bangladesh, hydropower in India's northeast all rise and fall with the Brahmaputra's flow. Any disruption upstream in Tibet can echo downstream with devastating force. China's dams are only part of the equation. What heightens the anxiety is Beijing's secrecy. Hydrological data vital for flood forecasting and disaster preparedness has often been withheld from New Delhi during periods of tension. In 2017, amid the Doklam standoff, China abruptly stopped sharing monsoon flood data. Assam was inundated by severe floods that year, and while no proof linked the disasters directly to Chinese actions, suspicion grew. Was Beijing sending a message? For India, the strategic nightmare is twofold. Flood as weapon. Sudden releases of water from upstream reservoirs could swamp Assam and Arunachal Pradesh, crippling transport, destroying crops, and overwhelming civilian populations. In an already flood-prone region, the consequences could be catastrophic. Drought as weapon. Just as devastating is the possibility of withheld water. In critical growing seasons, reduced flows could parch fields, devastate harvests, and fuel unrest downstream. Bangladesh, already acutely vulnerable to water stress and climate change, would be hit even harder. This asymmetric dependency means that, unlike disputes over land, the power dynamic is heavily tilted. India cannot control rivers that originate in Chinese territory. Bangladesh, even further downstream, has even less leverage. For both, China's dams loom not just as infrastructure, but as silent weapons. Water insecurity also compounds the border conflict. Each new dam project becomes another point of mistrust layered atop territorial disputes. Indian analysts warn of a future where water wars could erupt not as direct military clashes, but as crises triggered by manipulated river flows, crippling economies and forcing concessions. Bangladesh, caught in the middle, faces the most existential risk. Dhaka depends on the Brahmaputra, called the Jamuna in Bangladesh, for its rice fields and fisheries. Yet in any India-China confrontation, it would be Bangladeshi civilians who might suffer the worst flooding or drought, with no voice in the geopolitical rivalry that endangers them. Ironically, the melting of Himalayan glaciers under climate change makes the situation even more volatile. In the short term, faster glacial melt may increase river flows, raising the risk of catastrophic floods. In the long term, diminishing glaciers could reduce flows permanently, turning rivers into scarcer and, therefore, more politicized resources in the Himalayas. The rivers that have nourished civilizations for millennia are now entangled in the geopolitics of fear. The threat is not that water wars will be declared outright, but that water will become a shadow weapon used subtly, deniably, and devastatingly. The question many ask is, why has the Himalaya, a land of ice and myth, become so urgent a frontier today? The answer lies not just in territory or water, but in the global energy race. For Beijing, the high plateau offers more than strategic depth, it offers raw power. Tibet's roaring rivers, rushing down from glacial peaks, represent one of the last untapped frontiers of hydropower on Earth. Harnessing them could generate tens of thousands of megawatts, enough to electrify China's rapidly industrializing West and feed its insatiable energy appetite. This ambition is inseparable from China's larger vision of self-reliance. The Communist Party knows that to sustain growth and project power, it must secure reliable energy sources. Coal chokes its cities. Oil imports make it vulnerable at sea. Hydropower, clean and domestic, appears to be the solution, and the Himalayas, its reservoir. But here lies the tension. Every dam China raises upstream is not just an energy project, it is also a geopolitical fulcrum. India, too, is racing for energy independence, pouring money into its own dams in Arunachal Pradesh and hydropower schemes along Himalayan rivers. What was once a rivalry of borders has become a rivalry of kilowatts. The urgency is sharpened by climate change. Melting glaciers threaten water security across Asia, making the control of river flows a question of survival. Whoever commands the headwaters commands leverage over food supplies, electricity, and even political stability downstream. In the logic of power, to control water is to control life itself. Energy also binds the conflict to the wider world. China's Belt and Road Initiative seeks to export power grids, pipelines, and resource corridors across Eurasia. A megadam in Tibet doesn't just light Chinese cities, it can underpin factories that build ships, microchips, and missiles, extending Beijing's influence globally. For India, this creates an unbearable imbalance. To fall behind in the energy race is to risk strategic subordination. The Himalayas are no longer a frozen backdrop. They have become a battery of the future, one that both giants seek to wire into their national veins. This is why the border conflict feels sharper today than decades past. It is no longer about barren peaks alone. It is about who will own the rivers, the power, and the future. On paper, the story of China's rise in Tibet can be told as one of development. New dams bringing electricity, railways carrying goods, airports connecting remote towns. But behind the official narrative lies a deeper reality, the dual purpose of every watt of power, every mile of track, every concrete megastructure. Hydropower dams, for instance, are framed as green energy projects for sustainable growth. Yet, in military terms, they serve as strategic choke points. Electricity generated in Tibet doesn't just feed homes, it powers radar stations, surveillance grids, satellite uplinks, and energy-hungry data centers that anchor the People's Liberation Army (SPLI), cyber, and space operations. The railways are no different. What is presented as a lifeline for civilian tourism in Lhasa doubles as a troop conveyor, able to move an entire brigade of soldiers and heavy armor to the Indian frontier in a matter of days. Civilian airports morph into forward air bases, ready to host fighter jets or transport aircraft within hours of crisis. This blending of civilian and military utility is not an accident. It is the doctrine of military-civil fusion, Junmin Ronghe, a cornerstone of Xi Jinping's vision for national strength. In practice, it means no infrastructure is purely civilian. Every power grid, dam, or rail line is designed to pivot seamlessly into the machinery of war if the call comes. Even water management carries this duality. Dams can stabilize China's grid, but in conflict, the same sluice gates can be used as a hydrological weapon, unleashing floods or cutting downstream flow, crippling India's fields and hydropower projects. In peace, these dams look like engines of prosperity. In war, they become instruments of coercion. For Beijing, this duality is an asset. Every yuan spent develops Tibet and strengthens the PLA simultaneously. For New Delhi, it is a nightmare. India cannot easily tell where development ends and militarization begins. Is a dam just a dam? Is a road just a road? Or are they pieces of a quiet, creeping encirclement? This is why the Himalayan frontier feels like a pressure cooker. China insists its projects are purely developmental, while India sees hidden swords within civilian scabbards. The truth is that in today's strategic landscape, power, whether electrical, economic, or military, is never singular. It is always dual, always shadowed by its potential for domination. And so, the Himalayas are transformed not just into a wall of mountains, but into a labyrinth of dualious power, where the line between civilian progress and military threat grows thinner with every passing year. While the Himalayas draw headlines for their looming clashes of concrete and steel, Beijing's gaze is never locked on a single frontier. To the east, across the Taiwan Strait, lies what Chinese leaders call the core of core interests, Taiwan. Here, the struggle is not over rivers and ridgelines, but over identity, sovereignty, and the balance of naval power in the Pacific. For China's strategists, Tibet and Taiwan are not separate stories but interconnected theaters. The infrastructure in Tibet, the missile deployments, the air bases, all of these serve to secure China's western flank, freeing Beijing to concentrate more force on its eastern front. The stronger China feels in the Himalayas, the bolder it can be in the Taiwan Strait. Taiwan, in turn, has become the testing ground for Beijing's doctrine of comprehensive pressure. Unlike the subtle encroachment in Tibet, the approach in the east is more visible. Gray zone tactics with swarms of aircraft crossing the median line, naval patrols circling the island, cyber attacks probing Taiwan's networks, and constant political warfare aimed at fracturing public opinion. The geography differs, but the logic mirrors Tibet. Roads, ports, and power grids across China's coastal provinces are also dual use, ready to pivot to war, ridding a new civilian ferry route from Fujian. It doubles as a roll-on roll-off platform for amphibious armor, a wind farm off the coast. It can host surveillance radars or mask underwater drone activity. Even India watches the Taiwan front closely. For New Delhi, the question is stark. If China moves on Taiwan, will it also ignite a secondary crisis in the Himalayas to divide attention and strain India's partnership with the United States and Japan? Conversely, if India faces a border clash, will Beijing escalate in the strait to distract Washington? These are not hypotheticals, they are contingency plans etched into war rooms from Beijing to Washington. The two frontiers, the icy ridges of Tibet and the warm waters of the Pacific, are bound by one strategy: stretch rivals thin, present them with simultaneous dilemmas, and ensure that no adversary can focus all its might in one theater. For Xi Jinping, Tibet is the fortress and Taiwan is the prize. One provides strategic depth, the other represents national destiny, and together, they define the arc of China's 21st century ambitions westward into the mountains, eastward into the sea. India has long walked a tightrope between restraint and readiness. Publicly, New Delhi projects strategic caution, avoiding direct escalation with China, framing its disputes as defensive and emphasizing dialogue. But beneath that careful exterior lies a quieter playbook. Shadow options designed to exploit vulnerabilities in Beijing's long game. One such option lies in the Tibetan exile community. Though India has kept the Dalai Lama's activities largely symbolic, the infrastructure of exile, the monasteries, the schools, the government in exile in Dharamshala forms a latent lever. With a single policy shift, India could elevate Tibet from a humanitarian issue to a political flashpoint, reframing it as a question of autonomy and rights. Beijing knows this, which is why it applies relentless pressure on India to keep Tibet frozen. Another card rests in India's maritime geography. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands sit like a gatekeeper at the mouth of the Malacca Strait, through which flows 60% of China's oil imports. India doesn't need to match China's naval buildup ship for ship. By fortifying these islands, it can threaten China's jugular vein in the Indian Ocean. A small blockade here, even the hint of one, forces Beijing to divert attention from the Himalayas to its seaborne lifelines. India also experiments with infrastructure, mirroring building its own dual-use assets along the border. New roads and airstrips in Arunachal Pradesh, Ladakh and Sikkim don't yet rival China's vast network, but they signal intent. Combined with the Indian Air Force's mountain-hardened bases, these projects represent more than defense. They're footholds for limited offensive options. Should India ever choose to push beyond defense into deterrence by punishment, cyber and space domains form another quiet frontier. India's cyber units and satellite programs lack China's scale, but in a crisis, precision strikes on communication hubs, or even the disabling of select satellites, could level the playing field in unexpected ways. Unlike in conventional warfare, quality and surprise often outweigh sheer numbers. Then there's the alliance question. Officially, India resists formal blocs, clinging to its tradition of strategic autonomy. Yet through the Quad linking the US, Japan, and Australia, India enjoys the benefits of partnership without treaty. War games, technology transfers, and intelligence sharing knit New Delhi closer to Washington's orbit, even as it insists it remains independent. For Beijing, this ambiguity is a nightmare. Will India stay neutral, or will it swing decisively westward at the moment of crisis? In the shadows, India keeps these levers unpulled, each one. Tibet, the Andaman's border infrastructure, cyber, alliances, remains a potential escalation ladder. For now, restraint dominates policy. But should Beijing miscalculate, New Delhi may find itself forced to reach into the shadows and bring those options into the light. For all the fiery rhetoric and military maneuvers, India's long-term approach toward China is not one of conquest. It is one of deterrence, a careful calibration meant to signal, push too far, and the costs will outweigh the gains. Unlike Beijing, which has poured resources into building permanent infrastructure and testing its ability to project power, New Delhi frames its moves within a defensive doctrine. The Indian Army doesn't talk about seizing Chinese territory. Instead, its war games revolve around blunting incursions, absorbing the first blow, and then inflicting enough punishment to force a standstill. This philosophy is rooted in geography and history. India, unlike China, does not aspire to redraw Himalayan boundaries through force. What it seeks is denial, not domination. Denial of Beijing's ability to change facts on the ground unchallenged. Denial of unilateral control over rivers that flow south. Denial of unchecked naval presence in the Indian Ocean. Each denial is a message. Escalation will not come cheap. The doctrine extends to India's nuclear posture as well. While Beijing quietly expands its arsenal, India maintains a no-first-use policy. The logic is straightforward: nuclear weapons are not tools of aggression, but insurance against coercion. The very existence of that arsenal guarantees that any Chinese leader contemplating escalation must factor in catastrophic risks. In practice, this deterrence posture manifests as measured symmetry. When China builds a new road, India builds one of its own. When Beijing fortifies an airfield, New Delhi upgrades its nearby base. When the PLA moves divisions toward the frontier, Indian forces reposition in parallel. Rarely does India seek to outbuild or outspend, only to make sure that China understands it cannot win a quick low-cost war. This is why, despite its shadow options to bet, the Andaman's cyber warfare, India rarely activates them fully. To do so risks tipping deterrence into provocation, which could invite the very escalation New Delhi wishes to avoid. Instead, India keeps these tools visible enough to be credible, but restrained enough to be non-provocative. The essence of deterrence is psychological. It thrives, not in open confrontation, but in the anticipation of pain. By signaling preparedness without outright aggression, India aims to trap Beijing in a paradox: too costly to advance, too dangerous to escalate, and too uncertain to gamble. And so, while headlines often portray the Himalayan standoffs as contests of willpower, the deeper truth is subtler. India is not building toward an offensive strike. It is constructing a wall of deterrence by denial, a strategy that seeks not victory on foreign soil, but stability on its own. Every move in the Himalayas is not just a military maneuver, it is a signal reflected across a mirror of suspicion. Neither Beijing nor New Delhi fully trusts the other's intentions, and each interprets even the smallest shift as part of a larger, possibly sinister design. When China constructs a new road near the line of actual control, Indian intelligence assumes it is not just for logistics, but for a future armored thrust. When India builds forward posts in Ladakh or Arunachal Pradesh, Beijing frames it as a creeping attempt to nibble at Chinese territory. The mirror turns both ways, and with every reflection, mistrust multiplies. This dynamic extends beyond the mountains. China sees India's naval modernization and cooperation with the US and Japan as evidence of containment. India, in turn, views China's presence in Guadalhambantota and Djibouti as an encirclement strategy. Neither side admits openly to wanting war, but each prepares as though the other is preparing to strike first. This cycle of suspicion is not new. Since 1962, both nations have carried scars of betrayal. For India, the memory is of Chinese troops surging across the Himalayas after proclaiming friendship. For China, it is of a neighbor that grew closer to Moscow and Washington at moments of Beijing's vulnerability. The result is a relationship defined less by cooperation than by a constant calculation of worst-case scenarios. Even diplomatic overtures often become warped in this mirror. When Beijing calls for peaceful dialogue, Indian analysts read it as a stalling tactic, while China cements its infrastructure gains. When New Delhi speaks of confidence-building measures, Chinese strategists suspect it as a way to buy time, while India quietly enhances its deterrent capabilities. This is the essence of a security dilemma. Defensive measures look offensive through the lens of mistrust. Neither India nor China may genuinely want a large-scale conflict, but their preparations, roads, airbases, alliances, naval deployments, look like preparations for war when reflected back. The danger of this mirror is not that either side harbors an explicit plan to invade. It is that, in moments of crisis, whether a border clash, a cybernetic, or a political provocation, each will assume the other's worst intentions and act first. Suspicion can turn restraint into escalation in the blink of an eye. In this way, the Himalayas are not just a line on a map. They are a psychological frontier, where every action casts a distorted shadow in the other's mind. It is this distortion, more than weapons or terrain, that keeps the standoff volatile. If the Himalayas are the chessboard of this rivalry, then air power is the queen capable of sudden, decisive moves. Both China and India know that whoever dominates the skies over the high-altitude frontier will have the advantage in any future conflict. But here, the gap is stark and troubling for New Delhi. China's People's Liberation Army Air Force (PLAAF) fields a modern fleet, J-20 stealth fighters, upgraded J-10Cs, and heavy H-6 bombers that can carry long-range cruise missiles. With nearly 2,000 combat aircraft, the PLAAF dwarfs India's smaller and older fleet of around 600 to 650 fighters. While India's Rafales, an Su-30MK, is our formidable. they cannot close the sheer numbers gap. Infrastructure is another factor. China has built extensive airbases and runways in Tibet and Xinjiang designed to withstand high-altitude conditions. These facilities can house squadrons close to the border, supported by hardened shelters, fuel depots, and underground bunkers. India, in contrast, has only recently accelerated upgrades to its forward airfields in Ladakh, Arunachal Pradesh, and the northeast. Many remain vulnerable to missile strikes in the opening hours of a conflict. However, altitude cuts both ways. Aircraft operating from Tibetan bases must contend with thin air, which limits payload capacity and reduces takeoff efficiency. Indian fighters, operating from bases on the plains or foothills, enjoy denser air and thus better performance. This partially offsets China's numerical advantage. Then there is air defense. China has deployed HQ-29 long-range surface-to-air missiles, some modeled on the Russian S-300, and is also integrating the S-400 system purchased from Moscow. This creates a formidable air defense bubble along the frontier. India, too, is inducting S-400 batteries, but its coverage remains limited compared to China's layered, multi-tiered system. Yet India retains one strategic edge: combat experience. The Indian Air Force IAF has a track record of real-world operations from Kargil in 1999 to Balakot in 2019. Its pilots routinely train in contested environments and participate in joint exercises with Western air forces. By contrast, PLAAF pilots remain relatively untested in live combat, relying heavily on simulations. The air power gap, therefore, is not just about numbers or machines. It is about readiness, logistics, and resilience. China may overwhelm by sheer scale, but sustaining high-altitude operations across thousands of kilometers of rugged terrain is another challenge. For India, the danger is that without rapid modernization, even its qualitative edges could erode. In any conflict, the skies above the Himalayas will decide more than just tactical battles. They could determine who controls escalation. If one side can strike deep with air superiority, it gains leverage, not just at the border, but across the entire strategic equation. For both China and India, the strategic contest along the Himalayas is not frozen in place. It is a race against time, where every year counts and where delays carry consequences that could determine the outcome of the next crisis. For China, the clock ticks in its favor. Each passing year, the People's Liberation Army (PLA) grows stronger. New stealth fighters, advanced drones, long-range artillery, and cyber capabilities steadily close the gaps that once favored India. Infrastructure projects in Tibet and Xinjiang expand at breakneck speed. Highways, tunnels, railways, and high-altitude logistics hubs designed to move troops and supplies quickly to the front. The PLA's goal is clear: reduce friction, increase speed, and maximize pressure. India, meanwhile, is racing to keep up. But unlike Beijing's centralized resource-rich push, New Delhi's challenge is political will and economic capacity. Fighter squadrons retire faster than new jets arrive. Indigenous projects like the Tejas fighter and Arjun tank move slowly, while procurement of foreign systems faces delays from bureaucracy. Road and rail networks in the northeast remain incomplete, leaving Indian troops vulnerable to being outpaced in mobilization. And yet, India has one advantage: China cannot buy time in the field. Indian forces are already acclimatized to the high-altitude frontier, with decades of experience stationed at extreme elevations like Siachen and Ladakh. For the PLA, rotating troops into the Himalayas is logistically exhausting and physiologically punishing. Sustaining tens of thousands of soldiers at 14,000 feet is not something Beijing has mastered overnight. But the real race is not just about weapons or roads, it is about economic trajectories. China's economy, though slowing, remains several times the size of India's, allowing it to spend vastly more on defense each year. India, for now, must balance defense needs with domestic development. The fear in New Delhi is that if this gap widens unchecked, the strategic balance could tilt so far that deterrence collapses. Thus, India is hedging. Strengthening ties with the US, Japan, Australia, and Europe is part of this race, borrowing time through alliances and partnerships until its own military modernization catches up. China, aware of this, is in its own rush to consolidate its position before India's diplomacy and defense reforms bear fruit. It is a paradoxical clock. Both sides feel urgency, but for opposite reasons. China fears encirclement in the future and wants to secure its dominance now. India fears being outpaced and seeks to buy enough time to close the gap. In this sense, the Himalayas are not just a frozen frontier, they are a countdown timer. And the unanswered question is this: will the race end in deterrence, or in a clash neither side truly wants? In the Himalayan standoff, perception is as powerful as tanks or aircraft. What each side believes about the other's intentions, capabilities, and thresholds often dictates behavior more than the actual balance of power. This is where the China-India rivalry becomes dangerously double-edged. From Beijing's perspective, India is a secondary theater. The main strategic horizon is still the United States and the Pacific, yet China cannot ignore the growing defense ties between New Delhi and Washington. Every joint exercise, every technology transfer, every intelligence sharing pact feeds Beijing's suspicion that India is becoming an extension of American containment strategy. To China, Indian modernization is not just about defending mountain passes, it is about giving the US another lever against Chinese ambitions. From India's side, perception cuts differently. Many in New Delhi see China not as a distracted giant, but as a patient predator. Every road built in Tibet, every village sprouting near the border, every airstrip carved out of the plateau is read as proof of a slow-motion encirclement. Even when Beijing insists these are defensive measures, Indian analysts point to the asymmetry of terrain. Access China can surge forces quickly to the frontier, while India struggles with slower mobilization. The perception is that China is always preparing for offense, even if no shots are fired. This mutual suspicion becomes a trap. When China builds infrastructure, India builds counterroads. When India raises new mountain divisions, China stations more brigades in Tibet. Neither side intends to start a war, but both feel compelled to respond. Action feeds perception, perception feeds action. The result is a spiral where every defensive step looks offensive to the other side. And the most dangerous perception of all, overconfidence. If Beijing believes India will always back down because of economic inferiority, it risks pushing too far. If New Delhi convinces itself that Chinese troops lack mountain stamina and could be repelled in a clash, it may underestimate Beijing's ability to escalate. Both powers, in a sense, live under mirrors of misperception. Each side sees in the other what it fears most and prepares accordingly. Yet neither truly knows how far the other is willing to go. This is the double edge. Perception is a shield, but it is also a blade. It deters conflict by raising caution, but it also sharpens mistrust and accelerates preparations for the very war both sides seek to avoid. The Himalayas are both a barrier and a bridge, a wall of stone and snow that simultaneously divides and connects China and India. They embody the paradox at the heart of their rivalry. Geography that makes war costly, yet conflict constant. For centuries, the mountains were natural shields. Their towering peaks and treacherous passes discouraged large armies from moving across them, leaving cultural exchange limited and strategic confrontation rare. But in the modern era, technology eroded that isolation. Roads carved into cliffs, airstrips perched on plateaus. Satellites watching from orbital turned the Himalayas from an impassable wall into a contested frontier. Here lies the paradox. The very geography that makes decisive war nearly impossible also ensures endless friction. Neither side can achieve a quick, total victory in these high-altitude conditions. Supply lines are stretched to their breaking point. Soldiers fight as much against the environment as against each other. And territory often changes hands by mere meters. Yet because each perceives the frontier as vital to national identity and security, neither can back away. This paradox also plays out in the balance of risk. The Himalayas punish offense. Even a well-prepared army risks disaster from altitude sickness, avalanches, or logistical collapse. Defense, by contrast, is reinforced by the terrain. High ground favors the entrenched. Both China and India understand this, and yet, both continue to build roads, stations, and permanent garrisons in places where survival itself is uncertain. Why? Because to not do so would be to cede psychological and strategic ground to the other. The paradox deepens with politics. For India, holding the Himalayan line is about preserving sovereignty, a matter made sacred by memories of 1962. For China, asserting its presence is about enforcing its narrative of territorial integrity and signaling dominance over its periphery. Each side thus ties its legitimacy to geography, where compromise is almost unthinkable. Ironically, the Himalayas also force restraint. Neither side wants a full-scale war here, for the cost would be catastrophic and gains uncertain. The mountains impose limits, but within those limits, competition is constant, a chess game where each move is incremental, yet each carries the weight of national pride. Thus, the Himalayan frontier is not simply a border. It is a paradoxical arena where deterrence and provocation coexist, where strength and vulnerability blur, and where two great powers find themselves locked in a contest neither can decisively win, yet neither can abandon. The question that lingers is whether this paradox sustains stability through mutual caution or whether it ensures that the smallest spark, struck in the thin mountain air, could ignite a fire far larger than either side intends.